Saagar Enjeti of Breaking Point's fame is a smart political commentator, but he got a few things wrong on AI data centers in one of his recent segments. I've added a link to the description if you want to watch the full thing in full on his channel. And I'll try to do my best to roughly summarize the key points without taking specific clips. And I don't want to take too many things out of context. And so, first, I want to start with what I think he got right. Uh, the things, the thing that I think he gets the most accurate is the "not in my backyard" attitude that is driving a lot of pushback against local data centers. And I think that this is very reasonable because people look at their increased power bill, they look at the data center next to them, or at least in the general area that is causing this increased power bill, and they blame the data center for this and want the data center to go away or not have another data center move in to also increase their power bill. I think that his analysis is very correct that local politicians, certainly, and even into the state and perhaps national, but certainly local and state officials, can really take this issue and drive home that they don't want these sort of data centers moving in and causing increased power bills for local community members. Um, where I think the analysis starts to go a little sideways, and to be fair, this isn't being wrong, but also kind of I don't know um, kind of things that where Sagar says something along the lines of, well, I don't know exactly why they're building data centers in Oregon, but it's probably something to do with tax incentives and regulations. Otherwise, they would just build them in California. And to be sure, there are more tax incentives in Oregon and there are more regulations in California. That's not the only reasons why things like data centers are being built in Oregon. And in fact, they're not the primary reason why things are being built in Oregon. The primary reason why data centers are being built in Oregon is that Oregon has some of the cheapest power in the country. The reason why is that Oregon is full of mountains and Oregon is full of water, which means that Oregon is sort of the perfect geography for hydroelectric plants. And so Oregon's power being the cheapest in the nation is because they have an abundance of cheap hydroelectric power creation. Hydroelectric is 24/7 green energy. So not only is this good for the environment, but this is also good for AI companies, for example, that want to take advantage of low power while also talking about how they're having data centers that are good for the environment because at least these data centers are running on clean energy. And so the other things that make Oregon an attractive place to build a data center are wind energy, which is available in Oregon and also very affordable, and also that Oregon is a cool climate. Um, it makes sense that because the data center is in a cooler climate, there's less energy that needs to be spent on cooling. Building a data center in California, particularly Southern California, which is basically a desert, is a good way to light dollars on fire, um, almost literally. It's very expensive to do cooling in California, and part of that is just simply the climate. And Oregon has a cooler climate, so there's a lot of incentives there to build in Oregon. Um, After the hydro factor, the wind factor, the cooling factor, then comes things like tax incentives and to a certain extent regulation, particularly compared to California. So those are the primary reasons why Oregon. Um, Next, I think that it's a little bit misplaced to say that China is a good alternative for building a data center as opposed to in Oregon. Certainly, China is not in the neighborhood of Oregon. China is not going to increase power demand in Oregon directly. But to say that China is power abundant without any investigation is, I think, a little bit misplaced. China has a lot of power because um, that China is very committed to yes in my backyard as long as it's yes for industrial build out, which means that they have an incredible large number of yes hydro plants, yes clean energy plants, but also yes coal plants to provide that hard backbone. China built a record number of coal plants in 2024. There is a huge amount of dirty energy in China that results in any data center being built in China as causing more carbon dioxide emissions. Eventually, that carbon dioxide will float over to be above Oregon. Um, there's also these more economic socialized costs of building in China. Building in China means that all of the money that would be spent in the United States in dollars is instead spent to uh, build a plant in China, and that's spent in Chinese yuan. What that means is that there's going to be a bunch of currency that is exchanged into yuan, which weakens the dollar, strengthens the yuan, and as a result of that, it increases prices of America whenever America wants to import anything from China, and also indirectly because it's weakening the dollar overall, it's also making any import from any other country also more expensive as well. In addition, there's also a bigger trade deficit with China, which is not a good thing. That trade deficit is an ongoing cost. That's also going to additionally weaken the purchasing power of the American consumer and cause things to be more expensive, not just for the people in Oregon who would be near the data center, but also this is all consumers in all of America, and by extension, all consumers that use dollars. And then, sort of, the third socialized cost is that there are not just jobs that get reduced in the US, but also the growth of the US. The overall balance of, for example, debt to GDP is negatively affected if nothing can be produced. Not building a data center is bad for GDP. And so, if all of the things that want to be built become not built, then that's bad for growth. It's bad for debt to GDP. That means more money has to be spent taking care of interest, as opposed to paying for Social Security or healthcare for regular people. So I think that taking into sort of balancing the sort of political costs, the like localized harms of building a data center, and the national interest in making sure that a data center gets built, I think that there's a responsibility to make the costs for the local individuals smaller, because if it's really that good for a nation, there ought to be some way to compensate the locals for having that plant be built in their area. Certainly, that's true for data centers because there's a lot of money to be made in building data centers. So, Oregon has a number of laws already in place that have been passed as a result of local pushback that make data centers less of a cost and more of a benefit for local Oregonians. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't actually know if that's the correct thing to say for people who live in Oregon. But first of all, there is now a different rate for people who live in Oregon and businesses, and specifically data centers and crypto miners. This is a very straightforward improvement. That means for normal people, they have a different rate that is essentially subsidized by the government versus, these sort of industrial build outs. This makes a lot of sense in terms of making the locals happy. And I think that it's a very smart, common sense law that I think, as more data centers get built, would be replicated in a lot of other places. And I think it's also a pretty reasonable request that if there's a data center, it pays for it can't just socialize the costs of the data center, which is really sort of the problem here. Why is the data center socializing costs? Um, another thing, another way that Oregon makes sure that the data center doesn't socialize the cost is to make sure that the data center is able to prove that there's additional capacity going online in order to create the power that the data center is using. Now, in terms of like 12 to 24 months, um, let me take a step back. Data centers will go online in about 2 years. Additional power to generate the same demand for the data centers takes 3 to 5 years. There's about a 1 to 3 year gap where the data center is online, but it is not, it hasn't gotten all of the power generated for it to come online. So, where does that gap get made up for? In the case of Oregon, it mostly gets made up for in natural gas and coal plants in the northwest of the United States, places like Utah, for example. Um, and that power gets generated in a natural gas or a coal plant and gets transferred through very large transmission lines to Oregon. And this is not necessarily a problem for 12 to 24 months, but if this was a problem for 5 years or 10 years, it would start to become a really big issue. And the utilities have a plan for this. The utilities submit 5 year, 10 year, 20-year plans for how much demand they expect and how much additional industrial build out are they planning to create. And these plans are regularly reviewed and approved by the grid managers. So utilities are pretty good at managing this balance. But the problem here is that they can't predict how many data centers move in. And each data center can, for example, cost the electricity demands of 100,000 homes. It's one thing if a few more people move in, a few thousand people move in, that is beyond what the power company expects. But if it's 100,000 people, that's not within the plans of the utilities, and not that can't be reasonably expected to be within the plans of the utilities. So uh, either the data center has to, and this is the Oregon law, either the data center has to be able to generate the capacity or prove that it can generate, or that additional power is coming online to specifically take care of its needs, or the utility needs to update its plans and charge the data center accordingly. I think if the utility is able to charge the data center whenever it does the hookup, and instead of the current model for most places, which is just to socialize the cost, that goes a long way to making sure that AI data centers can still be built, but that the costs of the data centers are not social, that are not just like socialized to the nearby community. So that's what I have to say on the topic. Thank you for watching.